Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something that started as a smoker's salvation and turned into a teenage crisis: vaping. Not the sleek, Instagram-worthy kind. Not the fruit-flavored fantasy kind. I mean the real, actual story of how a Chinese pharmacist's invention became the most controversial consumer product since cigarettes themselves. And since this is our brand new channel, before you settle in, maybe take a second to hit like and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what you find here. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, dim those lights, switch on a fan for that soft white noise, get comfortable, and maybe check if there's a jewel hidden in your teenager's backpack. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered how something designed to help people quit smoking ended up getting a whole new generation hooked? Was vaping really safer or just differently dangerous? What made fruit-flavored nicotine feel like candy to 15-year-olds? Could big tobacco really resist getting involved? Or was this always heading toward the same old playbook? Would you have seen it coming, that this sleek device promising harm reduction would end up in high school bathrooms everywhere? And now, congratulations. You've just woken up at 2003. This year, everything goes sideways. A Chinese pharmacist named Han Lik just lost his father to lung cancer, and he's about to invent something that will change public health forever. Good luck. Let's start with grief, because that's where this story really begins. Han Lik was a pharmacist in Shenyang, China, working for a company that made ginseng products. He was also a pack-a-day smoker who'd tried quitting multiple times and failed spectacularly every time. Then, in 2002, his father died of lung cancer, the same disease killing millions of smokers worldwide. Han Lik was devastated, terrified, and desperate. He knew cigarettes were killing him too, but he couldn't stop. Nicotine patches didn't work. Gum tasted like punishment. Cold turkey felt impossible. So he did what desperate inventors do. He started tinkering in his workshop, trying to find a way to get nicotine into his lungs without the 7,000 toxic chemicals in cigarette smoke. What he came up with would change everything. Imagine watching your father slowly suffocate, watching cancer eat away at his lungs, knowing the entire time that the same fate is probably waiting for you. That's where Han Lik found himself in 2002. His father had been a heavy smoker for decades, and by the time the diagnosis came, it was already too late. The cancer had spread. There were no good treatment options in rural China at the time. All Han Lik could do was watch, helpless, as his father struggled to breathe, as each day brought more pain and less hope. When his father finally died, Han Lik made a promise at his bedside. He would find a way to quit smoking, or he would find a way to make smoking safer. He couldn't do both, but he had to do something. The problem was that quitting smoking is brutally hard. Nicotine is one of the most addictive substances known to humanity, right up there with heroin and cocaine. It rewires your brain, creating neural pathways that scream for another hit, another cigarette, another rush of dopamine. Han Lik had tried everything. He'd worn nicotine patches that left red welts on his skin and still didn't stop the cravings. He'd chewed nicotine gum that tasted like chemical warfare and made his jaw ache. He'd tried going cold turkey and lasted less than a week before the irritability, the headaches, and the desperate clawing need drove him right back to cigarettes. It wasn't a lack of willpower, it was chemistry. His brain had been hijacked, and there was no easy way to take it back. But Han Lik wasn't just any smoker trying to quit. He was a trained pharmacist with a background in chemistry and a workshop full of equipment. He started researching. He read medical journals, talked to other scientists, and studied the mechanics of addiction. What he learned was fascinating and frustrating. It wasn't the nicotine that was killing smokers. Nicotine, while highly addictive, was relatively harmless compared to everything else in cigarette smoke. The real killers were the tar, the carbon monoxide, the thousands of toxic chemicals released when tobacco burned. Combustion was the problem. So, what if you could deliver nicotine without burning anything? What if you could simulate the act of smoking, the hand-to-mouth motion, the inhale, the exhale, the ritual, without lighting anything on fire? Heinrich began experimenting with liquids. He knew that certain substances, like propylene glycol, could be heated to produce a vapor without actually burning. It was the same principle used in fog machines at concerts and theatrical productions. If he could dissolve nicotine in that liquid and turn it into an aerosol fine enough to inhale, he might have something. He worked late into the night, mixing chemicals, testing heating elements, trying to find the right combination. His early prototypes were clumsy and often dangerous. Some overheated and burned his throat. Others barely produced any vapor at all. But slowly, painfully, he refined the design. And finally, after months of trial and error, he created something that worked, a device that turned liquid nicotine into a smooth, inhalable mist that felt like smoking but wasn't. He called it the electronic cigarette, and he had no idea that he just invented the most controversial consumer product since cigarettes themselves. Heinrich's big breakthrough wasn't about creating nicotine. It was about delivering it differently. He realized that if he could turn liquid nicotine into a vapor, an aerosol fine enough to inhale, he could simulate smoking without actual combustion. No burning tobacco, no tar, no carbon monoxide. His solution was elegantly simple. Use ultrasonic waves to vibrate liquid at high frequencies, turning it into a mist. Think of it like a humidifier, but for nicotine. He mixed propylene glycol, a common food additive, with nicotine and flavorings, heated it gently, and created a cloud that looked like smoke, but wasn't. It felt like smoking. It scratched the psychological itch. And crucially, it didn't require fire. Heinrich called it the electronic cigarette, and in 2003 he filed for a patent. He had no idea he just invented the most disruptive consumer product of the 21st century. The genius of Heinrich's invention wasn't just in the chemistry, it was in understanding what smokers actually needed. Yes, they needed nicotine, but they also needed the ritual. The act of smoking is deeply psychological. It's the hand reaching for the pack, the flick of the lighter, the first drag in the morning, the exhale after a stressful meeting. Nicotine patches and gum could deliver the drug, but they couldn't replicate the experience. They felt medicinal, sterile, sad. Heinrich understood that if he wanted smokers to switch, he needed to give them something that felt like smoking, not something that felt like punishment for smoking. His early prototypes used ultrasonic technology, the same kind used in medical nebulizers and industrial humidifiers. A small piezoelectric element would vibrate at ultrasonic frequencies, around 20,000 hertz or more, creating tiny droplets of liquid suspended in air. When you inhaled, you pulled in this aerosol, which delivered nicotine to your lungs almost as efficiently as cigarette smoke. It was brilliant in its simplicity. No combustion meant no tar, no carbon monoxide, no burnt organic matter coating your lungs. You were inhaling vaporized liquid, not smoke. It looked like smoke. It felt like smoke, But chemically, it was something entirely different. The liquid itself was carefully formulated. Han Lik chose propylene glycol as the base because it was already widely used in food products, medications, and even stage fog. It was considered safe to ingest, and while inhaling it was a different matter. Early tests suggested it was far less harmful than inhaling burning tobacco. He added pharmaceutical-grade nicotine, extracted from tobacco plants. And then, crucially, he added flavorings. Just mild tobacco and menthol at first. Nothing fancy. The goal wasn't to make it taste amazing. The goal was to make it tolerable, familiar, something a cigarette smoker would recognize. When Han Lik tested his first working prototype on himself, the results were remarkable. The throat hit, that satisfying scratch at the back of the throat that smokers crave, was there. The nicotine rush came quickly, within seconds, just like a cigarette. And the exhale produced a visible cloud, thick enough to look impressive, but thin enough to dissipate quickly. It wasn't perfect. The flavor was a bit chemical. The device was bulky. And the battery, life was terrible. But it worked. For the first time in his adult life, Han Lik went an entire day without smoking a cigarette. He'd been vaping instead, and his lungs felt clearer, his breathing easier, his clothes didn't reek of smoke. He knew he had something. He filed for a patent in 2003, detailing the ultrasonic atomization process, the liquid formulation, and the battery-powered delivery system. He called it the electronic atomization cigarette. The name was clunky, but the idea was revolutionary. Han Lik wasn't trying to create a recreational device or a new way to get kids hooked on nicotine. He was trying to save lives, starting with his own. He genuinely believed that if he could convince smokers to switch from combustible cigarettes to vaporized nicotine, millions of lives could be saved. He wasn't wrong about the potential, but what he didn't anticipate, what no one could have anticipated, was how quickly his invention would be seized by corporations, marketed to the masses, and twisted into something far more dangerous than he ever intended. By 2004, his employer, Golden Dragon Holdings, rebranded as Ruyan, like smoke, and began manufacturing the devices for the Chinese market. And the e-cigarette, born from grief and genius, began its long, complicated journey from a smoking cessation tool to a global epidemic. Han Lik's invention didn't explode onto the world stage immediately. It started quietly in China, sold through his employer's company, Ruyan, which translates to, like, smoke. The first e-cigarettes were clunky, expensive, and looked vaguely like props from a low-budget sci-fi movie. They had 3 parts: a battery, an atomizer, and a cartridge filled with nicotine liquid. You screwed them together, pressed a button, and inhaled. The vapor tasted medicinal, slightly sweet, and nothing like actual tobacco. But it worked. For Chinese smokers desperate to quit, or at least feel like they were trying, it was revolutionary. By 2005, Ruyan was selling hundreds of thousands of units across China. News started spreading. Foreign entrepreneurs visiting China saw them in smoke shops and thought, wait, this could be huge. They were right. Within 2 years, the first shipments of e-cigarettes began trickling into Europe and North America, often marketed as smoking cessation devices to avoid scrutiny. The genie was out of the bottle, and it was exhaling clouds. China, in the mid-2000s, was a smoker's paradise and a public health nightmare. Over 300 million Chinese people smoked, making it the largest tobacco market in the world. Cigarettes were cheap, socially acceptable, and deeply embedded in the culture. Offering a cigarette was a sign of respect, of friendship, of hospitality, Refusing one could be considered rude. In this environment, smoking cessation products were a tough sell. Why quit when everyone around you is lighting up? But Han Lik's invention offered something different, a middle ground. You didn't have to quit nicotine, you didn't have to give up the ritual, and you didn't have to feel like you were depriving yourself. You could keep smoking, just without the fire. Ruyan marketed the e-cigarette aggressively, emphasizing health benefits and modern technology. Their ads featured sleek, professional-looking people vaping in offices, at restaurants, in places where smoking was banned. The message was clear. This isn't your grandfather's cigarette. This is the future. The devices themselves were crude by today's standards. They were heavy, about the size and weight of a traditional cigarette, but with a glowing blue LED tip that lit up when you inhaled. The batteries lasted maybe an hour of continuous use before needing a recharge, and the cartridges, pre-filled with nicotine liquid, had to be replaced constantly. Each cartridge was supposedly equivalent to about 20 cigarettes, but in reality, the vapor production was inconsistent, and users often went through them faster than expected. The flavor was it was an acquired taste. Imagine licking a battery while someone sprays artificial tobacco scent in your face. That's pretty close. But despite the flaws, sales took off. By 2005, Ruyan had sold over 300,000 units domestically and was beginning to export internationally. The company applied for patents in multiple countries, hoping to corner the global market before competitors emerged. Spoiler alert, competitors emerged immediately. Because here's the thing about e-cigarettes, they're not that complicated. Once the concept was out there, manufacturers across China started churning out knockoffs, improvements, and variations. Some were better than Ruyan's original, some were worse. Some exploded. But they all shared the same basic principle: battery, atomizer, nicotine liquid, vapor. Foreign businessmen visiting China for trade shows stumbled upon e-cigarettes in market stalls and smoke shops and immediately saw the opportunity. In the West, smoking rates were declining, tobacco taxes were skyrocketing, and smokers were being pushed to the margins of society. A device that let you smoke indoors without the smell, without the health risks, or at least with fewer health risks, was a potential gold mine. Entrepreneurs began placing bulk orders, shipping containers full of e-cigarettes back to Europe, Australia, and North America. By 2007, the first wave of e-cigarettes had arrived in Western markets, sold under dozens of brand names: Smoke 51, Green Smoke, Blue, V2. Most were cheap Chinese imports, rebranded and marked up 300%. They were sold online, in mall kiosks, and in specialty shops. The marketing was bold and largely unregulated. Quit smoking without quitting nicotine. Smoke anywhere. No tar, no toxins, no problem. It all sounded too good to be true, because in many ways, it was. These early devices were inconsistent, unreliable, and largely unstudied. No one knew what the long-term health effects might be. No regulatory agency had approved them. But that didn't stop people from buying them by the thousands. And just like that, Han Lik's invention, born from personal tragedy, designed to help smokers quit, became a global commodity, racing ahead of science, ahead of regulation, and ahead of anyone's ability to control where it was going next. E-cigarettes landed in the United States around 2007, smuggled in by curious smokers who'd bought them online or picked them up during trips abroad. At first, they were novelties sold in mall kiosks and sketchy websites with names like Smoke Anywhere and Blue Cigs. The marketing was bold. Quit smoking without quitting nicotine. Smoke indoors. No secondhand smoke. No tar. It sounded too good to be true, which should have been the first red flag. But Americans, especially smokers, tired of being shamed and taxed into oblivion, were intrigued. The devices were expensive, $100 or more for starter kits, and the cartridges tasted like burnt plastic mixed with vague hints of tobacco or menthol. But they worked well enough, and crucially, they weren't regulated. The FDA hadn't figured out what to do with them yet. Were they tobacco products, medical devices, recreational gadgets? No one knew. So companies sold them freely, making wild health claims and dodging oversight. It was the Wild West, and everyone wanted a piece of the vapor. By 2008, e-cigarettes were showing up everywhere in the United States. Mall kiosks dedicated entirely to vaping appeared seemingly overnight, staffed by enthusiastic salespeople who'd give you the full pitch. This is the future of smoking. No smell, no ash, no judgment. You can use it on planes, in restaurants, even in your office, nobody will know. That last part was technically illegal, but enforcement was non-existent. People were vaping in bars, in airports, in movie theaters. Some venues noticed and kicked them out. Others didn't care, or didn't even realize what was happening. It looked like smoke, but it didn't smell like smoke. So, was it really a problem? For American smokers, e-cigarettes offered something they hadn't had in decades: freedom. By the 2000s, smoking had been so thoroughly stigmatized and restricted that smokers felt like social pariahs. You couldn't smoke in restaurants, bars, offices, or most public spaces. Cigarettes cost upwards of $10 a pack in some cities, thanks to sin taxes. Anti-smoking campaigns plastered graphic images of diseased lungs on billboards. Smokers were lectured, judged, and ostracized. But e-cigarettes promised a way out. You could still get your nicotine fix without the social shame, without standing outside in the rain, without your coworkers making passive-aggressive comments about the smell clinging to your clothes. The early adopters were mostly middle-aged smokers, people who'd been smoking for decades and wanted to quit but couldn't. They saw e-cigarettes as a lifeline, and for some, it genuinely worked. They switched from cigarettes to vaping, and for the first time in years, they could breathe easier, climb stairs without wheezing, and taste food properly. Their success stories spread through online forums and word of mouth. I smoked 2 packs a day for 30 years, and I quit in a week with this thing. Testimonials like that were marketing gold, but the devices themselves were hit or miss. The batteries died constantly and took hours to recharge. The cartridges leaked, flooding your mouth with bitter nicotine liquid that tasted like poison and made you gag. The vapor production was weak and unsatisfying unless you puffed on the device like you were trying to inflate a balloon. And the flavors? Tobacco-flavored e-liquid tasted nothing like tobacco. It tasted like someone had described tobacco to an alien, who then tried to recreate it using only household chemicals. Menthol was slightly better, but still tasted medicinal, like inhaling cough syrup. Still, the industry grew. Small companies popped up overnight, importing bulk e-cigarettes from China, slapping American brand names on them, and selling them at massive markups. Some entrepreneurs saw an opportunity and went all in, opening vape shops, launching online stores, and evangelizing about the health benefits. The messaging was aggressive and often wildly exaggerated. 95% safer than cigarettes, approved by doctors, recommended by the World Health Organization. None of this was true. There were no long-term studies yet. No regulatory body had approved e-cigarettes, and the WHO was actually deeply skeptical. But who cared about facts when there was money to be made? What made the American arrival particularly chaotic was the complete lack of regulation. The FDA, which oversees tobacco and drug products, had no idea what to do with e-cigarettes. Were they tobacco products? Technically, yes, they contained nicotine derived from tobacco. But they weren't cigarettes. You didn't burn anything. So maybe they were drug delivery devices, like nicotine patches, but they weren't being sold as medical aids. They were being sold as consumer electronics, gadgets, lifestyle products. The legal gray area was enormous, and companies exploited it ruthlessly. Websites sold e-cigarettes to anyone with a credit card, no age verification required. Marketing materials made health claims that would have been illegal for actual cigarettes. And because there were no manufacturing standards, quality was all over the place. Some devices worked as advertised. Others were dangerous fire hazards with cheap lithium batteries that could explode in your pocket. But without regulation, there was no accountability. If your e-cigarette malfunctioned and burned your face, good luck getting compensation. You'd bought an unregulated product from an unregulated market, and you were on your own. By 2009, the American e-cigarette market was worth hundreds of millions of dollars and growing exponentially, and the FDA was finally starting to pay attention. But the question remained, what exactly were they looking at, and how the hell were they going to regulate it? By 2009, the FDA finally noticed that millions of Americans were inhaling unregulated nicotine devices, and they were not happy about it. The agency tried to classify e-cigarettes as drug delivery devices, which would have required rigorous testing and approval, effectively killing the industry overnight. But e-cigarette companies fought back hard. They argued that e-cigarettes weren't drugs. They were tobacco products, and therefore should be regulated far more loosely under tobacco laws. The legal battle dragged on for years, with companies like Enjoy and Blue e-cigs suing the FDA. Meanwhile, sales exploded. By 2010, e-cigarettes were generating hundreds of millions in revenue. The industry was growing faster than regulators could keep up. And while lawmakers debated definitions, one thing became clear: vaping wasn't going away. If anything, it was just getting started. And the people cashing in weren't just small startups anymore. Big Tobacco had started paying very close attention. The FDA's first move was aggressive. In 2009, they ordered customs officials to seize shipments of e-cigarettes at the border. The agency argued that because e-cigarettes delivered nicotine, a known drug, they were drug delivery devices and required FDA approval under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. That meant manufacturers would have to conduct years of clinical trials, prove safety and efficacy, and submit mountains of paperwork before they could legally sell their products. For the small e-cigarette companies, this was essentially a death sentence. They didn't have the resources for that kind of testing, and even if they did, the approval process could take a decade or more. But the industry wasn't going down without a fight. Two companies, Smoking Everywhere and Enjoy, filed lawsuits against the FDA, arguing that e-cigarettes shouldn't be classified as drug delivery devices. After all, cigarettes contained nicotine, and they weren't regulated as drugs. They were regulated as tobacco products. E-cigarettes, they argued, were no different. They contained nicotine derived from tobacco. They were used recreationally, and they should fall under the less stringent tobacco regulations, not the pharmaceutical ones. It was a clever legal strategy, and in 2010, a federal appeals court agreed. The court ruled that the FDA could only regulate e-cigarettes as drug delivery devices if they were marketed for therapeutic purposes, like helping people quit smoking. But if they were marketed as recreational tobacco products, they fell under the Tobacco Control Act instead. This ruling was a game changer. It meant e-cigarette companies could keep selling as long as they didn't make explicit health claims. They couldn't say this will help you quit smoking, but they could say a modern alternative to traditional cigarettes. They couldn't say doctor recommended, but they could imply it with images of people in lab coats. The companies adjusted their marketing overnight, scrubbing medical language from their websites and replacing it with lifestyle branding. Problem solved. Well, sort of. The FDA, now stuck regulating e-cigarettes as tobacco products rather than medical devices, still had a problem. The Tobacco Control Act gave them authority over tobacco products, but it didn't give them immediate power to ban or restrict them. The law required a lengthy rulemaking process, public comment periods, and careful consideration of the impact on public health and industry. It was bureaucratic quicksand. While the FDA worked through the process, e-cigarette companies flooded the market with new products, new flavors, and increasingly aggressive marketing. By 2011, e-cigarette sales in the United States had topped $500 million. By 2012, they doubled. The industry was growing so fast that traditional tobacco companies, which had been watching from the sidelines, decided they couldn't afford to ignore it any longer. If e-cigarettes were the future, they wanted in. And when big tobacco gets involved, everything changes. Lorillard Tobacco Company, maker of Newport cigarettes, made the first major move in 2012, buying Blue e-cigs for $135 million. Blue was one of the most recognizable e-cigarette brands at the time, known for its celebrity endorsements and ubiquitous mall kiosk presence. Overnight, e-cigarettes went from scrappy startup territory to Big Tobacco's new playground. And Big Tobacco brought something the startups didn't have: political power, lobbying budgets, and a century of experience manipulating regulators. Other tobacco giants followed. Reynolds American developed its own e-cigarette brand, Views. Altria, the parent company of Marlboro, launched Mark 10. British American Tobacco bought CN Creative, another major player. These companies weren't just dipping their toes in the water, they were diving in head first, pouring hundreds of millions of dollars into marketing, product development, and lobbying. And they had a clear strategy: position e-cigarettes as the future of nicotine consumption, safer than cigarettes, but still profitable, still addictive, and most importantly, still legal. The regulatory wars were just beginning. Consumer advocacy groups demanded stricter oversight. Public health officials warned that e-cigarettes could create a new generation of nicotine addicts. Some scientists argued they were a genuine harm reduction tool. Others said we didn't have enough data yet. Politicians, lobbied heavily by both sides, flailed around looking for answers. And meanwhile, the products kept selling. The companies kept growing, and millions of Americans kept vaping, blissfully unaware that they were test subjects in a massive, unregulated experiment. Big Tobacco had spent decades fighting an uphill battle. Declining smoking rates, massive lawsuits, crushing regulations, and a cultural shift that made smoking deeply uncool. Then along came vaping, a nicotine delivery system that looked modern, felt tech-forward, and wasn't technically smoking. It was too perfect to ignore. By 2012, the major players started buying in. Lorillard Tobacco bought Blue e-cigs for $135 million. British American Tobacco bought CN Creative. Altria, maker of Marlboro, began developing its own vaping products. Reynolds American jumped in too. These weren't hedged bets. They were full-scale invasions. Big Tobacco saw vaping as salvation, a way to keep nicotine addiction alive for a new generation that would never touch a cigarette. They poured billions into research, marketing, and lobbying. And they brought something the scrappy startups didn't have: infrastructure, political power, and a playbook honed over decades. The wolf wasn't just at the door. It had already moved in and redecorated. For decades, Big Tobacco had been on the defensive. The Surgeon General's report in 1964 had exposed the link between smoking and cancer. The Master Settlement Agreement in 1998 had cost the industry billions and restricted how they could advertise. Smoking rates in the United States had plummeted from over 40% of adults in the 1960s to less than 20% by 2010. Cigarettes had gone from glamorous to pariah. Movies no longer showed heroes lighting up. Restaurants banned smoking entirely. Even bars, the last holdout, started kicking smokers outside. For tobacco companies, the future looked grim until vaping came along. Vaping offered Big Tobacco something they desperately needed: plausible deniability. These weren't cigarettes. They didn't cause the same diseases, at least not provably, not yet. They could market them as reduced harm products, a way for smokers to transition away from combustible tobacco. They could target younger demographics who'd been raised on anti-smoking campaigns and would never consider buying a pack of Marlboros. And best of all, vaping was trendy. It was modern. It was tech. You weren't a smoker, you were a vapor. You weren't feeding an addiction, you were embracing innovation. When Lorillard bought Blue e-cigs for $135 million in 2012, it sent shockwaves through the industry. Blue was already one of the most recognizable e-cigarette brands, and now it had the backing of a tobacco giant. Lorillard immediately ramped up production and marketing, running television ads, something startups could never afford. The commercials featured attractive young people vaping at parties, concerts, and rooftop gatherings. The tagline was, "Aspirational, rise from the ashes." The subtext was clear: smoking is dead, vaping is the future, and Blue is your ticket to that future. Other tobacco companies scrambled to catch up. Reynolds American launched Views in 2013, backed by millions in advertising and distribution deals that put Views products in every convenience store, gas station, and pharmacy in America. Altria, not to be outdone, rolled out Mark 10, and then, in a move that would prove catastrophic for them, invested $12.8 billion in Juul in 2018. British American Tobacco developed Vype. Japan Tobacco launched Logic. Suddenly, every major tobacco company had skin in the vaping game. And they brought their playbook with them. Big Tobacco had always been masterful at lobbying, at shaping regulations in their favor, at delaying oversight until they'd already made their billions. They did the same with vaping. They funded studies showing e-cigarettes were safer than smoking, which, to be fair, they probably were. But safer than cigarettes is a low bar. It's like saying less deadly than jumping off a building. Technically true, but not exactly reassuring. They funded think tanks, hired scientists, and deployed armies of lobbyists to state capitals and Washington, D.C., all pushing the same message. Vaping is harm reduction. Don't overregulate. Let the market decide. But here's the thing. Big Tobacco understood better than anyone. You don't make money by helping people quit nicotine. you make money by keeping them hooked. And while they publicly positioned vaping as a tool for adult smokers to quit, internally they knew the real gold mine was getting non-smokers, especially young people, to start. Because once someone is addicted to nicotine, they're a customer for life. Whether they get it from cigarettes, vapes, or some future delivery system, they'll keep coming back. The industry poured money into flavors, into sleek designs, into marketing campaigns that felt less like tobacco advertising and more like tech product launches. They hired social media influencers, sponsored music festivals, and created branded content that blurred the line between advertising and entertainment. They knew they couldn't directly market to teenagers. That would be illegal, or at least politically toxic. But they could create a culture around vaping that teenagers would naturally gravitate toward. And they did. By 2015, vaping had gone from a niche smoking cessation tool to a full-blown cultural phenomenon. And big tobacco, which had been left for dead just a decade earlier, was suddenly thriving again, riding a cloud of vapor straight to the bank. While corporations fought for market share, a grassroots subculture was bubbling up from online forums and vape shops, the modders. These were hobbyists, often ex-smokers, who weren't satisfied with disposable cartridges and weak vapor. They wanted clouds, massive, billowing, competition-level clouds. So they started building their own devices. Custom batteries, sub-ohm coils, rebuildable atomizers, high-wattage mods that looked like something out of a steampunk fever dream. They mixed their own e-liquids, experimenting with flavors like unicorn milk and dragon's breath. Vape shops became gathering spots, part coffee shop, part electronics lab, where people swapped coil-building techniques and debated the merits of vegetable glycerin versus propylene glycol ratios. Vaping wasn't just a smoking alternative anymore. It was an identity, a hobby, a lifestyle. And the clouds. Oh, the clouds were glorious. But this culture, as fun and harmless as it seemed, was about to be weaponized by companies looking to hook a much younger audience. The mod community started small, mostly on Reddit, YouTube, and specialized forums like e-cigarette forum and Vapor Talk. These were people who'd tried the basic e-cigarettes from convenience stores and found them lacking. The vapor production was weak. The throat hit was inconsistent. The batteries died too quickly, so they started tinkering. They discovered that by using lower resistance coils, called sub-ohm coils, they could heat the liquid faster and produce dramatically larger vapor clouds. But that required more powerful batteries, which meant building custom devices from scratch using parts sourced from flashlight manufacturers, hobby electronics suppliers, and sketchy overseas vendors. These custom mods were chaotic works of engineering. Some used stacked 18650 batteries wired in series to boost voltage. Others used mechanical mods, devices with no circuitry, no safety features, just a battery, a button, and hope. If you build it wrong, it could vent, which is a polite way of saying it could explode in your hand. And occasionally they did. Videos of vape batteries exploding in pockets, setting couches on fire, or venting inside someone's mouth circulated online as cautionary tales. But the modders pressed on, refining their designs, sharing schematics, and pushing the limits of what these devices could do. And then there were the cloud competitions. Yes, cloud competitions. Events where vapors would stand on stage and exhale the biggest, thickest vapor clouds they could produce, judged on size, density, and duration. The winner might walk away with a few $100s and bragging rights. It was ridiculous, theatrical, and undeniably impressive. Watching someone exhale a cloud so thick it looked like a fog machine had malfunctioned was genuinely mesmerizing. The competitions drew crowds, sponsorships from vape companies, and media attention. Vaping had gone from a smoking cessation tool to a competitive sport. But the culture wasn't just about showing off. For many modders, it was about control. Cigarettes were a black box. You lit one end, inhaled, and hoped for the best. But with vaping, you controlled everything. You chose the nicotine level, the flavor, the vapor production, the throat hit. You built your own coils, adjusted your wattage, fine-tuned your airflow. It was DIY nicotine consumption, and for people who'd felt powerless against cigarette addiction, that control was empowering. Vape shops became community hubs. They weren't just retail spaces. They were social centers where people hung out, vaped together, shared tips, and bonded over their shared escape from cigarettes. The staff were usually vapers themselves, passionate and knowledgeable, eager to talk about resistance levels, coil wrapping techniques, and the difference between max VG and 50-50 blends. Shops hosted events, build nights where beginners could learn how to wrap coils, and tasting sessions where you could sample dozens of flavors. It felt less like buying a product and more like joining a subculture. And that subculture was overwhelmingly positive at first. These were people who'd quit smoking, who felt healthier, who were genuinely excited about helping others do the same. They weren't cynical, they weren't corporate, they were just enthusiasts who'd found something that worked for them and wanted to share it. But as vaping grew more popular, as corporations started pouring money into the industry, that grassroots culture started getting co-opted. Companies realized that the mod aesthetic, the big clouds, the custom devices, the rebellious DIY spirit was incredibly marketable. So they started producing their own high-powered devices, pre-built and polished, with all the cloud-chasing power of a custom mod, but none of the effort required to build one. They hired modders as influencers, paying them to showcase products and attend events. They sponsored competitions, turning grassroots gatherings into branded spectacles. The culture that had emerged organically was being commercialized, packaged, and sold back to the people who created it. And then the flavors got sweeter, the devices got sleeker, and the marketing started skewing younger. Because while adult ex-smokers might have been the core of the mod community, teenagers were watching, and they wanted in. In 2015, two Stanford graduates named James Monsees and Adam Bowen launched a device that would change vaping forever, Juul. It looked nothing like the clunky mods or cigarette-shaped devices that came before. It was sleek, minimalist, USB-sized, basically the iPhone of vapes. You could charge it in your laptop. It fit in your palm. And it delivered nicotine like a freight train. Juul used nicotine salts instead of the freebase nicotine in earlier e-cigarettes, which made the hit smoother, faster, and far more addictive. A single Juul pod contained as much nicotine as a pack of cigarettes. And the flavors? Mango, mint, creme brulee, fruit medley, designed to taste nothing like tobacco. Juul marketed itself as a tool for adult smokers, but let's be honest, the aesthetic was teen catnip. The ads featured young, attractive models vaping at parties. The influencer campaigns screamed cool, and teenagers noticed. Within 2 years, juuling had become a verb. High schoolers were doing it in bathrooms, during class, at the dinner table, and for the first time, a generation of kids who would never have touched a cigarette were getting hooked on nicotine. The epidemic had begun. James Monsees and Adam Bowen met at Stanford's design school, where they bonded over a shared frustration. They were both smokers who wanted to quit but hated every cessation product on the market. Nicotine patches were boring, gum was gross, and the e-cigarettes available in the early 2000s were clunky, embarrassing devices that looked like cheap plastic cigarettes from a dollar store. They wanted something different, something elegant, something that felt like the future. So they started a company called Plume, which initially focused on tobacco vaporizers, devices that heated real tobacco instead of vaporizing nicotine liquid. The products were innovative, but never quite caught on. Then, in 2015, they pivoted. They launched a new product under a new brand, Juul, and everything changed. The Juul device was a masterclass in design. It was rectangular, about the size of a USB flash drive, with smooth, rounded edges and a minimalist aesthetic. It came in a few subtle colors: silver, black, gold. It had no buttons, you just inhaled, and it activated automatically. The pods clicked in magnetically with a satisfying snap. Charging was simple. Plug it into any USB port. It felt premium, modern, Apple-esque. It didn't look like a cigarette or a vape mod. It looked like a gadget, a piece of tech you'd be proud to pull out in public. But the real innovation was chemical, not aesthetic. Juul used nicotine salts, a formulation that had been around for a while, but never popularized. Traditional e-cigarettes used freebase nicotine, which is harsh at high concentrations. You couldn't make a liquid with 50 milligrams of freebase nicotine per milliliter. It would burn your throat and make you cough uncontrollably. But nicotine salts, created by adding benzoic acid to nicotine, were smooth even at high concentrations. Juul's pods contained 5% nicotine by weight, 59 milligrams per milliliter, but it didn't feel harsh. It felt smooth, almost effortless. And the nicotine hit came fast and hard, mimicking the experience of smoking a cigarette far more closely than any previous e-cigarette. For adult smokers, this was revolutionary. Finally, a device that actually satisfied the craving. But for teenagers, it was something else. An easy, painless way to get absolutely blasted with nicotine. A few hits off a Juul delivered more nicotine than a few puffs of a cigarette, and it tasted like mango or mint, not burning paper and regret. Juul's early marketing was aggressive and undeniably youth-focused, even if the company later denied it. Their launch campaign, called Vaporized, featured young, attractive models in their 20s, vaping at parties, concerts, and art shows. The imagery was colorful, vibrant, energetic, nothing like traditional tobacco advertising. It felt more like a lifestyle brand, like Supreme or Red Bull. They ran ads in Vice magazine, sponsored music festivals, and hired social media influencers to post about Juul on Instagram and Twitter. The hashtag #JareDoItForJuul started trending. Memes exploded. Juul wasn't just a product, it was a cultural moment, and teenagers ate it up. By 2017, Juuling had become ubiquitous in high schools. Kids were vaping in bathrooms, in hallways, even during class. Teachers couldn't tell the difference between a Juul and a flash drive. The vapor dissipated quickly and didn't smell like traditional tobacco smoke. It smelled like fruit or candy. Parents had no idea, and the kids, they thought it was harmless, just flavored vapor, right? What's the big deal? The big deal was that a single Juul pod contained as much nicotine as an entire pack of cigarettes. And kids were going through a pod a day, sometimes more. They were inhaling nicotine levels that would have made a veteran smoker dizzy. And because nicotine salts delivered the drug so efficiently, the addiction set in fast. Within weeks, Kids who'd started juuling for fun found themselves unable to get through a school day without hitting their device. They were waking up with cravings. They were sneaking hits between classes. They were, by any definition, addicted. By 2018, Juul controlled over 70% of the U.S. e-cigarette market. They were valued at $38 billion, more than SpaceX, more than Airbnb. And they'd accomplished something remarkable and terrifying. They'd made nicotine cool again for a generation that had been raised to despise cigarettes. The device designed to help adult smokers quit had instead created millions of teenage nicotine addicts. And the epidemic was just getting started. By 2016, the vaping industry had discovered its secret weapon: flavors. And not just tobacco or menthol. We're talking cotton candy, gummy bear, birthday cake, strawberry cheesecake, and unicorn vomit. There were thousands of flavors, each more absurd than the last, sold in colorful bottles with cartoon mascots and names that sounded like rejected Willy Wonka products. The industry argued these flavors helped adult smokers transition away from tobacco. But let's call it what it was: kid bait. No 45-year-old pack-a-day smoker was dreaming about mango-flavored clouds. These flavors were designed to make vaping fun, sweet, and completely divorced from the harsh reality of nicotine addiction. And it worked brilliantly. Kids loved them. Teenagers stockpiled them. Parents had no idea what they were looking at when they found a sleek little pod labeled "Cool Cucumber" in their kid's backpack. The flavors made vaping feel harmless, like candy, like a treat, not a drug. And that's exactly what made them so dangerous. Because underneath all that fruit and frosting was the same addictive substance that had hooked generations before: nicotine, just wrapped in a prettier package. The explosion of flavors was both a marketing triumph and a public health disaster. E-liquid manufacturers realized early on that flavor was everything. Adult smokers trying to quit cigarettes didn't want their vape to taste like tobacco. They were trying to get away from tobacco. But they also didn't want it to taste medicinal, like nicotine gum or patches. They wanted something enjoyable, something that made the transition easier. So manufacturers started experimenting with flavors. Fruit flavors like strawberry and watermelon, dessert flavors like vanilla custard and caramel, even breakfast flavors like blueberry pancakes and cinnamon toast. At first, the flavors were aimed at adults. The marketing featured mature, sophisticated imagery. Think artisanal coffee shops and craft breweries, not playgrounds and candy stores. But as the market grew, the flavors got sweeter, more playful, more outrageous. Companies started naming their e-liquids things like Gummy Bear, Sour Patch Kids, Fruity Pebbles, and Rainbow Road. The bottles had bright colors and cartoon graphics. And the flavors themselves were designed to taste exactly like the candies kids grew up eating. It was no longer subtle. It was blatant. The industry's defense was always the same. Adults like sweet flavors too. And technically, that's true. Plenty of adults enjoy fruity or dessert-flavored vapes. But the data told a different story. Surveys showed that over 80% of youth e-cigarette users cited flavors as a primary reason they started vaping. Kids weren't choosing tobacco-flavored pods. They were choosing mango, mint, and fruit medley. The flavors made vaping approachable, fun, and far less intimidating than cigarettes. They masked the harshness of nicotine and made it easy to inhale, even for kids who'd never smoked before. And the sheer variety was staggering. By 2018, there were over 15,000 different e-liquid flavors on the market. You could walk into a vape shop and spend an hour sampling flavors: tropical punch, blue raspberry, pink lemonade, birthday cake, churros, bubble gum, root beer float. Some shops had flavor bars where you could custom mix your own blends. Want half strawberry, half cheesecake? Done. Want to add a hint of menthol to your watermelon? No problem. It was DIY candy chemistry, and teenagers loved it. Parents, meanwhile, were completely in the dark. When they found a little bottle labeled unicorn milk or Smurf juice in their kid's room, they didn't immediately think nicotine addiction. They thought it was some weird energy drink or novelty product. Even when they found the actual vape device, it often didn't look like anything they recognized. It looked like a USB drive, a pen, or a sleek gadget. And when their kid insisted it was just flavoring, many parents believed them. After all, why would something that tasted like cotton candy be dangerous? The flavors also played a psychological role. They made vaping feel innocent, childlike, nostalgic. You weren't inhaling a drug, you were tasting your favorite childhood candy. This cognitive dissonance made it easier for kids to justify their behavior and harder for them to recognize they were getting addicted. It didn't feel like smoking. It didn't smell like smoking. It tasted like a treat. How could it be bad? Public health officials saw what was happening and sounded the alarm. They pointed to the obvious. These flavors were designed to appeal to kids. The industry pushed back, claiming they were simply offering adult consumers variety and choice. But internal documents that later emerged told a different story. Companies were tracking youth trends, monitoring social media, and absolutely aware that their flavored products were popular among teenagers. They just didn't care. Or rather, they cared about profits more than they cared about kids. By 2019, the flavor debate had reached a boiling point. Public health advocates demanded a complete ban on all flavored e-cigarettes. The industry fought back with lobbyists, funded studies, and political pressure. And in the middle of this war, millions of teenagers kept vaping, kept getting hooked, kept inhaling fruit-flavored nicotine like it was harmless air. The flavors had done exactly what they were designed to do: make nicotine addiction taste delicious. By 2017, high schools across America were facing a crisis they didn't see coming: vaping. Kids were doing it everywhere: bathrooms, hallways, under desks, even during class. Teachers couldn't tell the difference between a USB drive and a Juul until clouds started appearing. School administrators were baffled. Traditional anti-drug programs hadn't prepared them for sleek, fruity, tech-forward nicotine devices that looked like office supplies. Disciplinary systems weren't equipped either. What's the punishment for vaping? Suspension? Detention? A stern lecture about lung health? Nothing worked. Kids kept vaping. Some schools installed vape detectors in bathrooms, yes, actual sensors that could detect vapor in the air. Others banned USB drives entirely. A few brought in police officers to conduct locker searches, but it was like trying to stop a flood with a broom. Vaping had become a social activity, a status symbol, a way to fit in. One study found that by 2018, over 20% of high school students had vaped in the past month. That's 1 in 5 kids. Teachers were exhausted, parents were terrified, and pediatricians started seeing something they'd never seen before. Teenagers with nicotine withdrawal symptoms, irritability, anxiety, inability to focus, all because they couldn't get through third period without hitting their Juul. The speed of the invasion was stunning. In 2016, vaping among high schoolers was still relatively niche. Mostly older kids, mostly those already experimenting with cigarettes or weed. But by 2017, It was everywhere. Freshmen were vaping. Middle schoolers were vaping. Kids who'd never touched a cigarette, who'd been raised on DARE programs and anti-smoking campaigns, were suddenly hooked on nicotine. And they didn't see it as a problem. They saw it as fun, as social, as cool. The bathrooms became ground zero. High school bathrooms had always been a refuge for rule breaking, cigarettes, graffiti, skipping class. But now they were filled with vapor clouds. Groups of kids would crowd into stalls, passing around a Juul, taking hits and exhaling massive plumes of mango-scented mist. Some schools' bathrooms looked like a fog machine had been left running. Teachers patrolling the halls would smell the sweet, fruity vapor and know immediately what was happening. But catching the kids in the act was nearly impossible. By the time a teacher pushed open the bathroom door, the vapor had dissipated and the devices had been pocketed. Administrators tried everything. Some schools installed vape detectors, sensors that could detect changes in air quality and alert staff when vaping was occurring. These devices cost thousands of dollars and were met with mixed results. Kids quickly figured out ways to bypass them, exhaling into backpacks, blowing vapor into water bottles, or simply moving to less monitored areas. Other schools banned all electronic devices that weren't phones, no flash drives, no portable chargers, nothing that could be mistaken for a vape. But Juuls were small enough to hide in pockets, socks, even bras. Confiscating them was a losing battle. Disciplinary measures were inconsistent and often ineffective. Should vaping be treated like smoking, a minor infraction with detention or a phone call home? Or should it be treated like drug possession, a serious violation with suspension or expulsion? Schools struggled to find the right balance. Too lenient, and kids didn't take it seriously. Too harsh, and parents complained that their kids were being punished for something that wasn't technically illegal. After all, vaping wasn't a crime. It was a violation of school policy, but so was chewing gum. The social dynamics made enforcement even harder. Vaping wasn't something kids did alone. It was a group activity. Sharing a Juul was a bonding ritual, a way to fit in, a currency of social capital. Kids who vaped were seen as cool, rebellious, in the know. Kids who didn't were square, uncool, left out. The peer pressure was immense. And because vaping was easy to hide and didn't have the stigma of smoking, kids felt comfortable doing it openly among their friends, even in semi-public spaces like parking lots or behind bleachers. Parents, for the most part, were blindsided. Many didn't even know what a Juul was until their kid got caught with one. And when schools sent home letters warning about the vaping epidemic, many parents dismissed it as exaggeration. Their kid wasn't vaping. They were good kids, honor roll students, athletes. But the reality was that vaping cut across all demographics. It wasn't just the bad kids or the smokers. It was everyone. Straight-A students, athletes, band kids, theater kids, the shy kid in the back of the class. Nicotine didn't discriminate. And then the health consequences started showing up. Pediatricians began seeing teenagers with symptoms they'd never seen before in non-smokers. Chronic coughing, shortness of breath, chest pain. Some kids were so addicted they were waking up in the middle of the night to vape. Others were experiencing panic attacks when they couldn't get nicotine. School nurses started keeping track of students who came in with rapid heartbeat, dizziness, and nausea, classic signs of nicotine overdose or withdrawal. Teachers reported students who couldn't focus, who were irritable and anxious, who asked to use the bathroom constantly just to get a hit. By 2018, the crisis had reached a tipping point. The CDC declared youth vaping an epidemic. Schools were holding emergency assemblies. Parents were demanding action. And teenagers, caught in the middle, were struggling with an addiction they didn't fully understand and couldn't easily quit. The high school invasion was complete, and the fallout was only beginning. Juul and its competitors swore up and down they weren't targeting kids. Their ads, they insisted, were aimed at adult smokers looking for alternatives. But the receipts told a different story. Early Juul campaigns featured 20-something models at rooftop parties, blowing clouds under neon lights, looking effortlessly cool. Their social media influencers were young, attractive, and aspirational. They sponsored music festivals and art shows frequented by teens and young adults. They used hashtags like Yo Vaporized and launched campaigns with taglines like Make the Switch. And perhaps most damning, they didn't aggressively age-gate their online sales. Teenagers could, and did, order Juul products with fake IDs or by simply lying about their age on a website. Internal documents that later surfaced showed Juul employees discussing youth appeal, monitoring teen social media trends, and even visiting high schools under the guise of educational outreach. It was Big Tobacco's playbook all over again. Deny, deflect, and rake in billions while a new generation got hooked. By the time the FDA and Congress started asking hard questions, the damage was done. Millions of kids were already addicted. The marketing strategy was brilliant in its deceptiveness. Juul never explicitly said, "Hey kids, buy our product." That would have been illegal, or at least politically suicidal. Instead, they created an aesthetic, a vibe, a cultural moment that teenagers naturally gravitated toward. Their launch campaign in 2015, called Vaporized, was a masterclass in indirect youth marketing. The ads featured young people, technically adults, but barely, in scenarios that screamed youth culture. House parties, music festivals, art galleries, dimly lit clubs. The models were diverse, attractive, and dressed in the kind of streetwear that teenagers idolized. They weren't smoking cigarettes. They were vaping Juuls, exhaling colorful clouds, looking relaxed and happy and impossibly cool. The ads ran in magazines like Vice, on websites frequented by young people, and across social media platforms where teenagers spent most of their time. Juul's Instagram account became a curated feed of aspirational lifestyle content. Concerts, travel photos, art installations, all featuring Juuls as subtle accessories. They didn't say, "This is cool," they showed it. And teenagers who are hardwired to seek social acceptance and emulate what they perceive as cool got the message loud and clear. But it wasn't just the advertising. Juul's product design itself was youth-focused, whether they admitted it or not. The device looked like a USB drive, which meant kids could charge it in school computers, hide it in plain sight, and carry it without arousing suspicion. The pods came in flavors like mango, fruit medley, and creme brulee, flavors that adults might enjoy, but that clearly appealed to younger palates. And the packaging was sleek, minimalist, and premium-looking, like an Apple product. It didn't feel like a tobacco product. It felt like a gadget, a lifestyle accessory, something you'd show off to friends. Social media was where the marketing really exploded, often organically, but sometimes with Juul's help. The company worked with influencers, people with large followings on Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube, to post about Juul. Some of these partnerships were disclosed. Many weren't. Influencers would casually feature Juuls in their content, in their hands at parties, on their desks while gaming, tucked into their pockets during vlogs. They'd use hashtags like #Juul, Juul Nation, and Juul for Juul. And their followers, many of whom were teenagers, saw this and wanted in. The hashtag Juul for Juul became a viral phenomenon. Kids started posting videos of themselves doing ridiculous stunts or challenges for Juul. It was absurd, meme-driven, and completely disconnected from smoking cessation. Juul had become a brand that teenagers wanted to associate with, not because it helped them quit smoking, most of them didn't smoke, but because it was fun, trendy, and rebellious in a low-stakes way. You weren't breaking the law. You weren't smoking cigarettes. You were just vaping, and everyone else was doing it too. Internal documents that emerged during lawsuits and congressional investigations revealed just how aware Juul was of their youth appeal. Employees discussed tracking social media trends among teenagers. They monitored which flavors were most popular with younger users. They knew their ads were resonating with high schoolers, and yet publicly, they maintained the fiction that they were only marketing to adult smokers. When questioned, Juul executives claimed they had no way of knowing who was buying their products or seeing their ads. It was a thin defense, and it didn't hold up under scrutiny. Perhaps the most damning revelation came from Juul's school presentations. In 2017 and 2018, Juul representatives visited schools under the guise of educational outreach, ostensibly to warn kids about the dangers of vaping. But the presentations were bizarre. Instead of discouraging use, they often downplayed risks, emphasized that Juul was totally safe, and sometimes even gave students free samples or Juul swag. Teachers and administrators were horrified. Parents were furious, and public health officials realized that Juul wasn't just failing to prevent youth vaping, they were actively contributing to it. The company also failed to implement basic safeguards on their website. Age verification was laughably easy to bypass. You just clicked a button saying you were over 18, and that was it. No ID check, no credit card verification that matched an adult's name, nothing. Teenagers ordered Juuls by the dozen, shipped directly to their homes. Some resold them at school for profit. Others stockpiled pods like they were collecting Pokemon cards. And Juul, despite being fully aware of the problem, did almost nothing to stop it until forced by regulators and public pressure. By 2018, the evidence was overwhelming. Juul had become the fastest-growing e-cigarette brand in history by capturing a youth market they claimed they never wanted. Their marketing had created a cultural phenomenon that turned vaping into a teenage rite of passage. And while they eventually pulled some of their flavored products and toned down their advertising, it was too little, too late. The damage was done. An entire generation had been marketed into nicotine addiction, and Juul had profited every step of the way. Juul's real innovation wasn't just design, it was chemistry. Traditional e-cigarettes used freebase nicotine, the same form found in cigarettes. It's harsh, especially at high concentrations, which is why early vapors used relatively low nicotine levels. But Juul used nicotine salts, a chemically altered form that's smoother on the throat even at much higher concentrations. This meant you could pack way more nicotine into a single puff without the painful burning sensation. It was a game changer. A single Juul pod contained 59 milligrams per milliliter of nicotine, roughly equivalent to a pack of cigarettes. And because the hit was so smooth, users didn't realize how much nicotine they were actually inhaling. Kids who would cough and gag on a cigarette could rip a Juul without flinching. They'd take hit after hit, sometimes going through an entire pod in a day. And their brains, still developing, still wiring themselves for adulthood, were being flooded with nicotine. The addiction set in fast and hard. By the time they realized they were hooked, it was too late. Nicotine salts had turned vaping from a smoking alternative into something potentially even more addictive than cigarettes themselves. To understand why nicotine salts were so revolutionary and so dangerous, you need to understand a bit of chemistry. Nicotine in its natural state, as it exists in tobacco plants, is a weak base. When extracted and used in cigarettes or early e-cigarettes, it's converted into freebase nicotine, which is the most potent and rapidly absorbed form. It's what gives smokers that immediate throat hit and nicotine rush. But freebase nicotine is harsh. At concentrations above about 20 milligrams per milliliter, it becomes almost unvapable. It burns your throat, makes you cough, and feels like inhaling sandpaper soaked in battery acid. This is why most early e-cigarettes used relatively low nicotine levels, usually between 6 and 18 milligrams per milliliter. It was enough to satisfy cravings for light to moderate smokers, but heavy smokers often found it inadequate. That's where nicotine salts came in. By adding an acid, usually benzoic acid, to freebase nicotine, you create a salt. This chemical modification lowers the pH of the nicotine, making it less alkaline and therefore much smoother on the throat. You can now use concentrations of 50, 60, even 70 milligrams per milliliter without the harsh burning sensation. The smoothness is deceptive. You're inhaling massive amounts of nicotine, but it feels gentle, almost pleasant. It's like the difference between drinking straight vodka and a vodka cocktail with fruit juice. The alcohol content is the same, but one goes down way easier. Juul wasn't the first to use nicotine salts, but they were the first to popularize them and pair them with a device designed for maximum efficiency. Each Juul pod contained 5% nicotine by weight, which translates to about 59 milligrams per milliliter. For comparison, that's roughly equivalent to smoking an entire pack of cigarettes. But because the nicotine was in salt form, users could inhale it without discomfort. And because Juul's device was so efficient at vaporizing the liquid and delivering it to the lungs, the nicotine hit came fast. Within seconds, you felt the rush. For adult smokers, this was a revelation. Finally, a device that could satisfy even heavy smokers with just a few puffs. Many long-term smokers who'd failed to quit with patches, gum, or earlier e-cigarettes found success with Juul. They could get their nicotine fix quickly and efficiently, without the tar, carbon monoxide, and thousands of other chemicals in cigarette smoke. It was, for them, genuinely life-changing. But for teenagers, it was a disaster. Kids who'd never smoked a cigarette, who had no tolerance for nicotine, were suddenly inhaling doses that would make a seasoned smoker dizzy. And because it was so smooth, they didn't realize how much they were consuming. A few hits off a Juul delivered more nicotine than several cigarettes, but it felt effortless. Kids would take 10, 15, 20 hits in a row, chasing the buzz, not understanding that they were flooding their developing brains with one of the most addictive substances on Earth. Nicotine is particularly dangerous for adolescents. The teenage brain is still developing, especially the prefrontal cortex, which governs decision-making, impulse control, and emotional regulation. Nicotine exposure during this critical period can cause lasting changes in brain chemistry. It affects the development of neural pathways, increases susceptibility to addiction, and can impair cognitive function, attention, and memory. Studies have shown that teenagers who use nicotine are more likely to develop other substance addictions later in life. Their brains are essentially being rewired to crave drugs. and the addiction happened fast. With cigarettes, kids would often experiment, cough through a few smokes, and either decide it wasn't for them or gradually build up a tolerance over months. But with Juul, the addiction curve was steep. Kids would start vaping casually at a party with friends out of curiosity. Within weeks, they were vaping daily. Within a month, they were waking up with cravings. Within 2 months, they couldn't get through a school day without sneaking hits between classes. They were, by any clinical definition, addicted. The symptoms were undeniable. Teenagers who tried to quit reported severe withdrawal, irritability, anxiety, depression, difficulty concentrating, insomnia, intense cravings. These are the same symptoms adult smokers experience when trying to quit, but teenagers weren't prepared for them. They didn't understand why they felt so awful, why they couldn't focus in class, why they snapped at their friends and family. They just knew they needed to vape. And when they couldn't, everything felt wrong. Pediatricians started reporting cases of teenagers experiencing nicotine poisoning, nausea, vomiting, rapid heartbeat, dizziness, seizures from consuming too much too quickly. Some kids were vaping so heavily they were literally overdosing on nicotine. And because Juul pods were small and easy to carry, kids were going through multiple pods a week, sometimes multiple pods a day. They were consuming more nicotine than pack-a-day smokers, and their bodies couldn't handle it. The nicotine salts revolution had succeeded in making vaping more efficient and more satisfying. But it had also made it exponentially more addictive, especially for young people with no prior nicotine exposure. Juul had solved the problem of how to deliver high doses of nicotine smoothly and efficiently. What they hadn't solved, or chosen to ignore, was the problem of what happens when millions of teenagers get their hands on that technology. The answer, as it turned out, was an addiction. Crisis unlike anything public health officials had seen in decades. As vaping exploded, public health experts started sounding alarms. But their warnings were drowned out by marketing, misinformation, and the seductive appeal of harm reduction. Yes, vaping eliminated many of the toxic chemicals in cigarette smoke. No tar, no carbon monoxide, no combustion byproducts. But safer than cigarettes didn't mean safe. Studies began showing that vaping still carried serious risks: lung inflammation, cardiovascular stress, potential DNA damage, and unknown long-term consequences because the technology was simply too new to study over decades. The aerosol wasn't just harmless water vapor, as companies claimed. It contained ultrafine particles, heavy metals like nickel and lead from the heating coils, formaldehyde, and other toxic chemicals. And for teenagers, whose lungs and brains were still developing, the risks were even greater. But none of this slowed sales. The industry pushed back hard, funding their own studies, hiring scientists to testify that vaping was 95% safer than smoking, a statistic based on limited evidence and generous assumptions. Smokers desperate to quit believed it. Kids thought it was just flavored air, and regulators, stuck in bureaucratic limbo, couldn't move fast enough to stop it. The warnings were there. They were just ignored. The 95% safer claim became the industry's shield and sword. It originated from a 2014 report by Public Health England, which concluded that e-cigarettes were likely 95% less harmful than smoking traditional cigarettes. The statistic was based on expert opinion and limited evidence, not comprehensive long-term studies. But it didn't matter. The vaping industry latched onto it, repeated it endlessly, and used it to counter any criticism. Vaping advocates cited it in debates, Companies featured it in marketing materials, and lobbyists wielded it like a club against regulators. The message was clear. If you're worried about vaping, you're ignoring science. But the truth was more complicated. Yes, vaping eliminated the most harmful aspect of smoking: combustion. When you burn tobacco, you create thousands of toxic chemicals, including tar, carbon monoxide, arsenic, benzene, and formaldehyde. These are the chemicals that cause lung cancer, heart disease, emphysema, and other smoking-related illnesses. E-cigarettes don't burn anything, so they don't produce these combustion byproducts. In that sense, vaping is undeniably less harmful than smoking, but less harmful doesn't mean harmless. E-cigarette aerosol isn't just flavored water vapor, despite what companies claimed in their early marketing. It's an aerosol, a suspension of tiny particles and gas that contains nicotine, propylene glycol, vegetable glycerin, flavorings, and a host of other chemicals. Some of these chemicals are benign when ingested, but dangerous when inhaled. Propylene glycol, for example, is used in food and cosmetics and is considered safe to eat. But when heated and inhaled, it can irritate the lungs and cause inflammation. Vegetable glycerin, another common base ingredient, can break down into acrolein, a toxic compound that irritates the respiratory tract. Then there are the flavorings. The chemicals used to create flavors like cinnamon roll or buttered popcorn are often the same chemicals used in food production, where they're perfectly safe. But inhaling them is a different story. Diacetyl, a chemical that gives butter flavor, has been linked to a condition called popcorn lung, a serious and irreversible lung disease. While most e-cigarette manufacturers eventually removed diacetyl from their products, many other flavoring chemicals remain largely unstudied in terms of inhalation safety. We simply don't know what happens when you heat these chemicals and breathe them into your lungs day after day for years. The heating coils themselves presented another risk. Most e-cigarettes use metal coils made from nickel, chromium, or other alloys to heat the liquid. Over time, these coils degrade, releasing tiny metal particles into the aerosol. Studies have detected heavy metals like lead, nickel, tin, and aluminum in e-cigarette vapor. These metals can accumulate in the lungs and bloodstream, potentially causing long-term health problems. And because the devices and liquids were largely unregulated, quality control was inconsistent. Some products contained far higher levels of contaminants than others. Researchers also began finding evidence of cardiovascular effects. Nicotine, regardless of delivery method, raises blood pressure, increases heart rate, and constricts blood vessels. It's a stimulant, and while it might not cause lung cancer on its own, it can contribute to heart disease, especially in people with pre-existing conditions. Studies on e-cigarette users showed increased arterial stiffness, reduced blood flow, and elevated markers of cardiovascular stress. For adults switching from cigarettes, these risks were likely lower than continuing to smoke. But for teenagers with no prior nicotine exposure, these risks were entirely unnecessary. Perhaps most concerning was the lack of long-term data. E-cigarettes had only been widely available for about a decade. You can't study 20-year health outcomes when the product has only existed for 10 years. Cigarettes took decades to reveal their full harm. Lung cancer rates didn't spike until the 1950s and 60s, 30 to 40 years after cigarette use became widespread. What if e-cigarettes followed a similar pattern? What if the kids vaping in 2018 would start developing serious health problems in the 2030s or 2040s? We simply didn't know, and that uncertainty should have been reason enough for caution. But the industry didn't want caution. They wanted growth, so they funded their own research, studies designed to show that vaping was safe, or at least safer than smoking. They hired scientists, many with ties to the tobacco industry, to testify at hearings and write op-eds. They created front groups with official-sounding names like the Vapor Technology Association to give their messaging legitimacy. And they flooded social media with testimonials from people who'd quit smoking by switching to vaping, positioning themselves as heroes of harm reduction. Public health officials tried to push back. The American Lung Association, the American Heart Association, and the American Academy of Pediatrics all issued statements warning about the risks of vaping, especially for young people. The CDC and FDA issued alerts. Researchers published studies showing lung damage, cardiovascular effects, and addiction potential. But their voices were quieter, their messaging more complicated. Vaping might be safer than smoking for adults trying to quit, but it's still dangerous, especially for kids, doesn't fit on a billboard or in a tweet. The industry's message, vaping is 95% safer than smoking, was simple, catchy, and easy to believe. Smokers desperate to quit wanted to believe it. They latched onto vaping as their last hope, their escape from a deadly habit. And for many, it worked. But teenagers who'd never smoked and never needed an alternative believed it too. They thought vaping was basically harmless, just flavored clouds, just a little nicotine. What's the big deal? The warnings were there, in medical journals, in press releases, in congressional testimony, but they were ignored, dismissed, or drowned out by an industry that had too much to lose if people started listening. In the summer of 2019, emergency rooms across the United States started seeing something terrifying. Previously healthy young people showing up with severe lung injuries. They couldn't breathe. Their chests felt like they were on fire. X-rays showed their lungs looked like they'd been chemically burned. Doctors were baffled. The patients all had one thing in common. They vaped. By August, the CDC was investigating. By September, the media had a name for it. EVALI, e-cigarette or vaping product use-associated lung injury. Over 2,800 cases were hospitalized. 68 people died. Panic spread. Parents threw out their kids' vapes. Schools sent emergency alerts. Politicians called for immediate bans. But here's the twist. Most of the severe cases weren't linked to legal nicotine vapes like Juul. They were linked to black market THC cartridges that had been cut with vitamin E acetate, a thickening agent that's safe to eat but catastrophic to inhale. Still, the damage was done. The crisis shattered the illusion that vaping was harmless. It revealed how little we actually knew about what people were inhaling, and it exposed a massive, unregulated underground market where people were mixing chemicals in garages and selling them to kids. For the first time, the public saw vaping not as a trendy gadget, but as a genuine public health threat. And the industry, which had spent years dodging responsibility, suddenly had nowhere to hide. The first cases appeared in Illinois and Wisconsin in June 2019. Young people, mostly in their teens and 20s, started showing up at hospitals with respiratory symptoms: coughing, shortness of breath, chest pain, nausea, vomiting, and fever. At first, doctors thought it was pneumonia or a viral infection, but traditional treatments didn't work. Antibiotics did nothing. Antivirals did nothing. The patients kept getting worse. Chest X-rays and CT scans showed something alarming. The patient's lungs looked like they'd been exposed to toxic fumes or chemical burns. Fluid was building up. Inflammation was severe. In the worst cases, patients needed to be intubated and placed on ventilators. Some required ECMO, extracorporeal membrane oxygenation, a last resort treatment where a machine oxygenates the blood outside the body. And when doctors asked what these patients had in common, the answer was clear. They all vaped. Some vaped nicotine products. Others vaped THC. Some vaped both. But they all used e-cigarettes. By July, the number of cases had climbed into the dozens. By August, hundreds. The CDC issued a health alert, warning clinicians across the country to be on the lookout for similar cases. State health departments launched investigations. And the media picked up the story, running terrifying headlines about vaping-related deaths and mysterious lung illness. Panic spread quickly. Parents who'd been concerned about vaping were now terrified. Kids who'd thought vaping was harmless were suddenly second-guessing. And the vaping industry, which had spent years insisting their products were safe, was thrown into crisis mode. Sales plummeted. Stock prices for companies like Juul and Altria tanked. Politicians from both parties called for immediate action. President Trump announced the administration was considering a ban on all flavored e-cigarettes. State legislatures rushed to pass emergency restrictions. It felt like the entire vaping industry was on the verge of collapse. But as the CDC investigated, a more complicated picture emerged. The cases weren't distributed evenly across all types of vaping products. The vast majority of hospitalized patients, over 80%, reported using THC vapes, not just nicotine. And many of them had obtained those THC cartridges from informal sources, friends, dealers, black market sellers. These weren't products purchased from licensed dispensaries with lab testing and quality control. They were homemade or counterfeit cartridges, often filled with THC oil that had been cut with additives to increase volume and profits. In September, the CDC identified the likely culprit, vitamin E acetate. This oily substance, derived from vitamin E, is perfectly safe to consume or apply to the skin. It's used in cosmetics and supplements. But when heated and inhaled, it's dangerous. Vitamin E acetate is thick and sticky, and when it enters the lungs, it doesn't evaporate or break down easily. It coats the delicate alveoli, the tiny air sacs where oxygen exchange happens, and causes severe inflammation. Essentially, it's like coating your lungs with cooking oil and then wondering why you can't breathe. Black market THC cartridge manufacturers had been adding vitamin E acetate to their products as a thickening agent. THC oil is expensive, and dealers wanted to stretch it, cutting the oil with vitamin E acetate to make their cartridges look fuller and more potent. Consumers had no way of knowing. The cartridges looked legitimate, tasted fine, and got you high. But with every puff, they were coating their lungs with a substance that was slowly destroying them. Once the CDC pinpointed vitamin E acetate, they tested lung fluid samples from patients and found it in every single case. The mystery was solved. This wasn't a problem with nicotine vapes or legal cannabis products. It was a problem with unregulated black market THC cartridges. The legitimate vaping industry breathed a sigh of relief. The crisis wasn't their fault. It was the fault of illegal products. But the damage was done. Public perception of vaping had shifted overnight. Even though the E-Valley crisis was primarily caused by black market THC products, the association between vaping and lung injury was now firmly cemented in people's minds. Parents didn't care about the distinction between legal nicotine vapes and illegal THC cartridges. They just knew vaping could kill you. Teenagers, spooked by the news coverage and graphic stories of young people on ventilators, started questioning whether their Juul was really as safe as they'd thought. The crisis also exposed a darker reality. There was a massive, entirely unregulated underground market for vaping products, particularly THC. In states where cannabis was still illegal, or where legal dispensaries were too expensive or inaccessible, people turned to black market dealers. And those dealers, operating with zero oversight, were cutting their products with whatever they could find to maximize profits. Vitamin E acetate was just one example. Who knew what else was being added? Heavy metals, pesticides, synthetic cannabinoids. No one was testing these products. No one was regulating them. And teenagers, who were often the primary consumers, had no way of knowing what they were actually inhaling. The E-Valley crisis killed 68 people and hospitalized nearly 3,000. It was a public health emergency that shook the vaping industry to its core and forced a national conversation about regulation, safety, and the risks of both legal and illegal products. It shattered the myth that vaping was harmless and revealed just how little oversight existed in an industry that millions of people, many of them children, were relying on. And while the crisis eventually subsided as vitamin E acetate was removed from products and awareness spread, the scars remained. Vaping would never again be seen as the safe, innocuous alternative it had once been marketed as. In 2019, Juul's CEO, Kevin Burns, was summoned to Capitol Hill. Lawmakers from both parties were furious. They'd watched vaping rates among teenagers skyrocket. They'd heard from parents whose kids were addicted. They'd seen the lung injury headlines, and they wanted answers. The hearing was brutal. Burns tried to stick to the script. Juul was meant for adult smokers. They never marketed to kids. They were committed to solving the youth vaping problem. But the evidence was damning. Internal emails showed Juul had knowingly targeted young people. Their ads ran on teen-focused platforms. Their flavors were clearly designed for youth appeal, and their lobbying efforts had actively fought regulation. One particularly devastating moment came when a congressman held up a Juul device and asked, "Can you explain to me why this looks like a USB drive that a teenager would use?" Burns stammered. He had no good answer. Shortly after the hearing, Kevin Burns resigned. Juul pulled most of its flavored pods from the market. They pledged to do better. But the damage was done, not just to their reputation, but to an entire generation of kids who were now addicted to their product. The congressional hearings didn't kill Juul, but they exposed the industry for what it was. Big Tobacco 2.0, dressed in Silicon Valley aesthetics. The congressional hearing on July 25, 2019, was one of those rare moments where politicians from across the political spectrum united in righteous anger. The House Oversight Subcommittee on Economic and Consumer Policy had called in executives from Juul, and the atmosphere was tense from the moment Kevin Burns sat down at the witness table. Behind him, parents of teenagers addicted to vaping filled the gallery, some holding photos of their kids, others clutching crumpled Juul pods as evidence. Representative Raja Krishnamurthy, the subcommittee chairman, opened with a statement that set the tone. For years, Juul marketed highly addictive nicotine products to young people. You've hooked a generation of kids on nicotine, and you did it knowingly, deliberately, and for profit. Burns, looking uncomfortable in his suit, tried to project calm confidence. He insisted that Juul had always been committed to keeping their products out of the hands of minors, that their mission was to help adult smokers quit, and that they took the youth vaping issue seriously. But the lawmakers weren't buying it. They came armed with evidence: internal Juul emails, marketing materials, social media posts, sales data, school reports. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez held up printouts of Juul's early Instagram posts featuring young, attractive models partying with Juuls. "Who is this marketing to?" she asked, pointedly. Burns claimed the models were adults. They're in their 20s. Ocasio-Cortez shot back. "Do you know what teenagers aspire to look like? People in their 20s. Representative Rashida Tlaib grilled Burns on Juul's school presentations, where company representatives had visited high schools and told students Juul was totally safe. Burns admitted those presentations were a mistake and that the company had ended the program. But the damage was already done, Tlaib reminded him. Thousands of students had been told by Juul representatives, company representatives, that vaping was harmless. Perhaps the most damning exchange came when Representative Marc de Saulnier held up a Juul device and a USB drive side by side. "Can you explain to me why your product looks indistinguishable from a USB flash drive?" Burns tried to argue that the design was about portability and discretion for adult smokers. De Saulnier wasn't having it. Or maybe it's because you wanted kids to be able to hide it from their teachers and parents. The gallery erupted in applause. The hearing also featured testimony from parents and teenagers. Meredith Berkman, co-founder of Parents Against Vaping E-Cigarettes, described her son's addiction to Juul, how it had started casually at a party and spiraled into daily use, anxiety, and withdrawal. She held up her son's collection of empty Juul pods, dozens of them saved in a shoebox, as evidence of how much nicotine he'd consumed. A high school student testified about how Juul had taken over his school, how kids traded pods like currency, how he'd seen classmates shake and cry when they couldn't access nicotine. Burns tried to express sympathy, to claim that Juul shared their concerns. But every attempt felt hollow. The evidence was too overwhelming. Internal documents showed that Juul had tracked youth social media trends, monitored which flavors were most popular among teenagers, and designed their marketing to appeal to younger demographics. They'd sponsored events at venues frequented by underage attendees. They'd worked with influencers who had large teenage followings. They'd failed to implement effective age verification on their website. And they'd lobbied against regulations that would have restricted youth access. By the end of the hearing, Burns looked exhausted. Lawmakers accused him of being the Joe Camel of his generation, a reference to the cartoon mascot that R.J. Reynolds Tobacco used in the 1980s and 90s to market cigarettes to children. It was the ultimate insult, comparing Juul to the most notorious example of youth-targeted tobacco marketing in history. And Burns had no rebuttal. Just 2 months later, in September 2019, Kevin Burns resigned as Juul's CEO. The company issued a statement thanking him for his service and announcing new leadership committed to resetting the company's relationship with regulators and the public. But the resignation felt less like accountability and more like a PR move. Burns left with a golden parachute, and the company's fundamental problems remained. In the wake of the hearings, Juul announced several policy changes. They pulled their mango, creme, fruit, and cucumber-flavored pods from the market, leaving only menthol and tobacco. They shut down their US-based social media accounts. They pledged to invest more in age verification technology and to support Tobacco 21 legislation, which would raise the minimum age to purchase tobacco products from 18 to 21. They claimed to be turning over a new leaf. But public health advocates were skeptical. The flavors were already in the market. Millions of kids were already addicted. And Juul's new policies did nothing to address the black market of counterfeit pods and disposable vapes that had exploded to fill the gap. Critics argued that Juul's reforms were too little, too late, a calculated attempt to avoid a total ban while preserving as much market share as possible. The congressional reckoning had exposed Juul to the world. It had forced the company to acknowledge, however reluctantly, that they'd played a role in the youth vaping epidemic. But it hadn't solved the problem. Kids were still vaping. Juul was still selling products. And the cycle of addiction, fueled by nicotine and corporate greed, continued to spin. By 2020, the FDA had finally had enough. After years of deliberation, delays, and mounting public pressure, they announced a ban on flavored vaping products, except for tobacco and menthol flavors. The goal was simple: remove the flavors that appealed to kids. No more mango, no more mint, no more cotton candy. The vaping industry erupted. Small vape shop owners said the ban would destroy their businesses. Adult vapers argued their rights were being stripped away to solve a problem caused by irresponsible companies. Lobbyists flooded Washington, but public health advocates cheered. Finally, they said, the government was taking action to protect children. The ban went into effect in early 2020, but it was full of loopholes. It only applied to pod-based systems like Juul, not the open tank devices popular in vape shops, and it exempted menthol, which was still appealing to many young users. So what happened? Teenagers switched. They moved to disposable vapes, which weren't covered by the ban and came in every flavor imaginable. Brands like Puff Bar exploded in popularity, offering the same fruit flavors in a cheap, single-use format. The ban had tried to close the door, but kids just found another window. And once again, regulators were left playing catch-up while the industry stayed 3 steps ahead. The FDA's flavor ban, announced in January 2020, was supposed to be the decisive blow against youth vaping. After years of mounting pressure from parents, public health groups, and politicians, the agency finally acted. The policy was straightforward. Manufacturers of pod-based e-cigarettes, Juul, Vuse, Enjoy, and others, could no longer sell flavored cartridges unless they were tobacco or menthol flavored. The ban targeted the flavors that data showed were most popular with teenagers: fruit, mint, candy, and dessert flavors. The reaction was immediate and polarized. Public health advocates celebrated. Organizations like the Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids and the American Academy of Pediatrics issued statements praising the FDA for taking action. Parents' groups shared the news with relief. Finally, someone was doing something about the epidemic that had hijacked their kids' brains. But the vaping industry was furious. Small vape shop owners, the mom-and-pop businesses that had built their livelihoods around selling e-liquids and custom devices, felt betrayed. Many of these shops catered to adult ex-smokers, people who'd successfully quit cigarettes by switching to vaping, and who genuinely enjoyed the variety of flavors available. To them, the ban felt like collective punishment. Their customers were adults making informed choices, and now they were being restricted because teenagers had abused the system. The industry's lobbying groups launched an aggressive campaign. They funded studies claiming that adult vapers would return to smoking if flavors were banned. They organized protests and letter-writing campaigns. Vape shop owners testified at town halls, arguing that the ban would force them out of business and eliminate jobs. They positioned themselves as David fighting Goliath, small businesses crushed by heavy-handed government regulation, designed to appease moral panic. But the deeper you looked, the more holes appeared in the ban. First, it only applied to pod-based systems. Open tank devices, the kind sold in vape shops where users filled their own tanks with bottled e-liquid, were completely exempt. This meant that adults could still access any flavor they wanted, as long as they bought it in a refillable format rather than a pre-filled pod. The FDA argued this exemption was necessary because open tank devices were less popular with teenagers, who preferred the convenience and discretion of pods. Second, the ban exempted menthol. Menthol-flavored vaping products remained legal, ostensibly because menthol cigarettes were still legal and the agency didn't want adult menthol smokers to lose their only alternative. But this was a huge loophole. Menthol was still appealing to young users. It was cool, minty, and masked the harshness of nicotine. Teenagers who'd been vaping mango or mint jewel pods simply switched to menthol. Sales of menthol pods skyrocketed. And third, most critically, the ban didn't cover disposable vapes. Disposable e-cigarettes had been around for years, but they were a minor part of the market, mostly cheap gas station products that didn't work very well. But after the flavor ban, disposables became the industry's escape hatch. Companies like Puff Bar, Hyde, Elf Bar, and a dozen others flooded the market with single-use devices pre-filled with flavored nicotine. Because disposables weren't pod-based, they were all-in-one devices. They weren't covered by the FDA ban. And because they were cheap, colorful, and came in every flavor imaginable, teenagers flocked to them. Puff Bar became the new jewel almost overnight. The devices were brightly colored plastic sticks, about the size of a highlighter, filled with nicotine salt e-liquid in flavors like lychee ice, banana ice, and OMG, a blend of orange, mango, and guava. They cost about $10, lasted for 200 to 300 puffs, roughly equivalent to a pack of cigarettes, and then you threw them away. No charging, no refilling, no maintenance, just vape and toss. Teenagers loved them. They were even easier to hide than Juul. They came in more flavors, and they were sold at every corner store and gas station with minimal age enforcement. Within months of the flavor ban, disposable vapes had replaced pod systems as the go-to device for high schoolers. By late 2020, Puff Bar alone was generating hundreds of millions in revenue, and countless knockoff brands were flooding in from China. The FDA tried to respond. In July 2020, the agency sent warning letters to companies selling disposable vapes, ordering them to stop. Puff Bar temporarily pulled its products from the U.S. market and then rebranded and returned a few months later, claiming their devices now used synthetic nicotine rather than tobacco-derived nicotine, which they argued placed them outside the FDA's jurisdiction. It was a brazen legal maneuver, and it worked for a while. Other companies followed suit. The market exploded with synthetic nicotine products, all marketed with the same flavors, the same youth appeal, and the same addictive nicotine concentrations. The FDA was stuck in legal limbo, trying to expand its authority to cover synthetic nicotine, while companies continued to sell to anyone with $10. The flavor ban, intended to be a decisive regulatory action, had turned into a game of whack-a-mole. Ban pods, teenagers switched to disposables. Ban disposables, companies switched to synthetic nicotine. Close one loophole, the industry opens another. And through it all, kids kept vaping, kept getting addicted, and kept finding new flavors to hook them. The only thing that had changed was the device in their pocket. By 2022, Congress finally closed the synthetic nicotine loophole, giving the FDA authority over all nicotine products, regardless of source. But by then, the disposable vape market was entrenched, worth billions, and more popular than ever. The flavor ban had failed not because the idea was wrong, but because the execution was full of holes. The industry was more creative than regulators anticipated, and enforcement was nearly impossible. Flavors were still everywhere. Kids were still vaping. And the epidemic rolled on. Vaping didn't just spread through ads in stores. It spread through screens. TikTok, Instagram, Snapchat, YouTube, all became breeding grounds for vape culture. Influencers filmed themselves blowing massive clouds, doing tricks, reviewing new flavors, and making vaping look effortlessly cool. Some had millions of followers. Vape companies didn't even need to pay for ads anymore. The content was organic, viral, and far more effective than any billboard. Kids saw their favorite creators vaping and thought, if they're doing it, why shouldn't I? The algorithms amplified it. Once you watched one vape video, dozens more flooded your feed. There were tutorials on how to hide vaping from parents, how to exhale discreetly, how to buy vapes underage using fake IDs. It was a masterclass in peer pressure, scaled to millions. Social media platforms tried to crack down, banning vape ads, removing underage content, but it was whack-a-mole. New accounts popped up instantly, hashtags evolved to avoid detection, and the influencers kept posting, often without disclosing paid partnerships or affiliate links. For teenagers scrolling late at night, vaping looked like the norm. It looked fun, rebellious, and harmless. And by the time parents realized what was happening, their kids were already hooked, their feeds already flooded, their algorithms already trained to show them more. Social media transformed vaping from a product into a culture, and from a culture into an identity. And it happened fast. By 2017, vaping content was everywhere. On YouTube, creators posted vape reviews, unboxing videos, and cloud competitions where they tried to exhale the biggest vapor clouds possible. These videos racked up millions of views. The comment sections were filled with teenagers asking where to buy devices, which flavors were best, and how to hide vaping from parents. On Instagram, vape accounts posted aesthetic photos, clouds backlit by sunset, colorful devices arranged like art, models exhaling vapor in moody black and white shots. The accounts had names like Owza Vape Life, Cloud Chaser, and Vape Nation, and they built massive followings by posting daily content, running giveaways, and engaging with fans. Many were secretly sponsored by vape companies, though disclosures were rare or buried in fine print. But the real explosion happened on TikTok. The platform's algorithm was perfectly designed to spread vaping culture. Short, addictive videos set to trending music, showing people doing vape tricks, blowing rings, jellyfish clouds, French inhales, or just casually vaping while lip-syncing or dancing. The content felt spontaneous, authentic, and relatable. It didn't feel like advertising because most of it wasn't. It was just kids filming themselves, showing off, and sharing their lives. And TikTok's algorithm didn't need you to follow vape accounts to see vaping content. If you watched one video, the algorithm assumed you were interested and fed you more. Within minutes of scrolling, your For You page could be filled with vaping videos, even if you'd never searched for them. For teenagers who spent hours on TikTok daily, this meant constant exposure to vaping culture, normalizing it, making it seem like everyone was doing it. Vape tricks became a competitive subculture. Kids filmed themselves mastering increasingly complex tricks and challenging others to replicate them. The videos were mesmerizing, vapor rings stacking on top of each other, clouds shaped like jellyfish, elaborate exhales choreographed to music. It looked cool, it looked skillful, it looked fun, and it made vaping seem like a harmless hobby, not a nicotine addiction. Tutorials proliferated: how to hit a vape without coughing, how to exhale discreetly so teachers don't notice, how to hide your vape in a hoodie sleeve, a tampon box, a hollowed-out book, how to order vapes online with a fake ID. These videos framed vaping as a game, a challenge, a rebellious act that was low risk and high reward. The tutorials didn't mention addiction. They didn't mention nicotine poisoning or lung damage. They just focused on the thrill of getting away with it. Influencers, some with millions of followers, casually featured vaping in their content. They didn't always explicitly endorse vaping, they just did it. In the background of a makeup tutorial, while gaming, during a vlog about their day. It was normalized, integrated into their lifestyle, presented as just another thing cool people did. And their followers, many of whom were teenagers, noticed. Some influencers did take money from vape companies, though the partnerships were often murky. Influencers would post about a new vape flavor or device, include a discount code in their bio, and earn a commission on sales. But they rarely disclosed these partnerships in compliance with FTC guidelines. To viewers, it looked like genuine enthusiasm, not paid advertising, and that made it more powerful. Social media platforms eventually started cracking down. Instagram and Facebook banned ads for vaping products. TikTok prohibited content that promoted or sold vapes. YouTube demonetized vape-related videos and added age restrictions. But enforcement was inconsistent and easily circumvented. Creators used code words, calling vapes USB drives or pens to avoid detection. They posted on secondary accounts. They moved to smaller platforms like Discord or Telegram where moderation was minimal. Hashtags evolved constantly to avoid bans. Dagger vape became Shaktakiegyuk vape. Ibrajul became Dakgang Gazul or Jewel Gang. And when those got flagged, new ones emerged. The community adapted faster than the platforms could moderate, and the content kept flowing, liked, shared, and algorithmically amplified to millions of impressionable viewers. For parents, this was invisible. They saw their kids scrolling TikTok, watching funny dances and comedy sketches. They didn't know their kids were also being bombarded with vaping content, normalized and glamorized by people they admired. By the time parents discovered their child was vaping, the damage was often already done. The addiction had set in, and the algorithm had trained their child's brain to associate vaping with fun, creativity, and social acceptance. Social media didn't create the vaping epidemic, but it accelerated it. It took a product and turned it into a movement, a culture, an identity that millions of teenagers wanted to be part of. And once you were in, the algorithm made sure you stayed, feeding you more content, more tricks, more reasons to keep vaping. It was peer pressure at scale, engineered by artificial intelligence and executed by teenagers with smartphones. And it worked devastatingly well. When regulators banned flavored pods, the industry pivoted instantly. Enter disposable vapes. Brands like Puff Bar, Hyde, and Elf Bar flooded the market with single-use devices pre-filled with flavored nicotine. They were cheap, $10 to $20, brightly colored, and came in flavors like rainbow candy and strawberry watermelon. They required no charging, no refilling, no maintenance. You vaped it until it died, then threw it away. For teenagers, they were perfect, affordable, accessible, and easy to hide. You could buy them at gas stations, bodegas, even from older kids at school. And because they technically weren't pod-based, they slipped through the FDA's flavor ban. Sales exploded. By 2021, disposable vapes dominated the youth market. But they came with a dark side. The environmental impact was catastrophic. Millions of plastic and lithium battery devices tossed into landfills every month, and the disposables often contained even higher nicotine concentrations than Juul pods. Some had 50 micrograms or more of nicotine salt, enough to give even experienced vapors a head rush. Kids were getting addicted faster than ever, and the devices were designed to be irresistible. Bright colors, sweet flavors, zero learning curve. The industry had found another loophole, and once again, teenagers paid the price. Disposable vapes weren't new. They'd existed since the early days of vaping, mostly as cheap, low-quality gas station impulse buys. They were the kind of product you'd grab if you forgot your real vape at home, or if you wanted to try vaping without committing to a rechargeable device. They were generally terrible: weak vapor production, bad flavor, batteries that died halfway through, and a reputation for being the bottom of the barrel. But after the FDA's flavor ban in early 2020, disposables became the industry's golden ticket. Companies realized they could exploit a loophole. The ban only applied to pod-based cartridge systems, not all-in-one devices. So they redesigned disposables, making them better, more appealing, and far more addictive. Puff Bar led the charge. The company, founded in 2019, created a disposable that actually worked. It was sleek, colorful, and came in flavors that sounded like they belonged in a candy store. Cool mint, strawberry, lychee ice, OMG. The devices were small, about the size of a highlighter, with smooth plastic casings in vibrant colors: hot pink, electric blue, neon green. They looked fun, they looked harmless, and they were everywhere. The appeal was instant. For $10 to $15, you got a device pre-filled with 2 milliliters of nicotine salt e-liquid at 5% concentration, about as much nicotine as a pack of cigarettes. The device lasted for about 300 puffs, roughly equivalent to smoking a pack. You didn't need to charge it. You didn't need to buy separate pods or refill it. You just vaped it until it stopped working, then tossed it and bought another. For teenagers, this was perfect. Juul had become expensive. A device cost $30 to $40, and pods were another $15 to $20 for a 4-pack. But disposables were cheap enough to buy with lunch money, and because they came in a single piece with no replaceable parts, they were easier to hide. No telltale pods rolling around in your backpack. Just a small, colorful stick that could pass for a pen or a makeup product. Gas stations, convenience stores, and smoke shops stocked disposables by the hundreds. And because the products were technically compliant with the flavor ban, they weren't pod-based. Retailers could sell them without fear of FDA enforcement. Kids bought them with fake IDs, or by simply walking into stores that didn't check. Older siblings or friends bought them in bulk and resold them at school for a markup. The distribution network was seamless. By late 2020, Puff Bar was everywhere. High schoolers were posting about them on TikTok. Flavors became status symbols. Lychee ice was the trendy choice. OMG was for people who wanted something unique. Kids collected the empty devices, lining them up on shelves like trophies, showing off how many they'd gone through. It was Juul all over again, just with a different device. And the competition exploded. Seeing Puff Bar's success, dozens of other companies launched disposables. Hyde, Elf Bar, HQD, Posh, Breeze, Fume. They all followed the same formula: bright colors, candy flavors, cheap prices, massive nicotine content. Some brands differentiated themselves with even more puffs: 500, 800, eventually devices claiming 1,500 puffs or more. turning disposables into multi-day affairs. The environmental impact was staggering. Each disposable vape contained a lithium-ion battery, plastic casing, a heating coil made of metal, and residual e-liquid. None of these components were designed to be recycled. They were designed to be thrown away. And millions of them were being discarded every week, ending up in landfills, oceans, and streets. Environmental groups sounded alarms. These weren't just plastic straws. They were electronic waste, filled with toxic materials and non-biodegradable components. Worse, many of the batteries were still functional when the e-liquid ran out. People were tossing fully charged lithium batteries into trash cans, creating fire hazards in garbage trucks and landfills. Some cities reported increased incidents of fires caused by discarded vape batteries. But the industry didn't care. Disposables were too profitable to stop. The nicotine content was another problem. Many disposables contained 5% nicotine, the same as Juul, but some contained even more, 6%, even 7%. And because the devices lasted longer, users were consuming more nicotine per device than they ever did with pods. Teenagers who'd been vaping Juul pods were now going through disposables that delivered 2, 3, even 4 times as much nicotine. The addiction intensified. Public health officials were horrified. The flavor ban, which was supposed to reduce youth vaping, had instead shifted the market to an even more accessible, more addictive, and more environmentally destructive product. In 2022, the FDA finally took action, ordering companies like Puff Bar, Hyde, and others to stop selling their products in the United States. But enforcement was weak. Many companies simply rebranded, moved their operations overseas, or claimed they'd reformulated their products to use synthetic nicotine, which briefly placed them outside FDA jurisdiction. And new brands kept emerging. Elf Bar became the new market leader, imported from China and distributed through a shadowy network of wholesalers. By 2023, Elf Bar was the most popular vaping product among high school students, surpassing even Juul at its peak. The devices came in dozens of flavors, with sleek designs and aggressive marketing, and they were impossible to keep off shelves. The disposable vape takeover was complete. The industry had found yet another way to hook kids, to dodge regulation, and to profit off addiction. And once again, regulators were left scrambling, always one step behind, while millions of teenagers vaped away, one disposable device at a time. While America grappled with its vaping epidemic, the rest of the world was watching and importing. Vaping spread like wildfire across Europe, Asia, Latin America, and beyond. In the UK, vaping was embraced as a smoking cessation tool, heavily regulated and even recommended by public health agencies. In Australia, vaping was banned outright, but a black market thrived anyway. In China, where it all began, vaping became a status symbol among young professionals. And in countries with weak tobacco regulations, vaping companies moved in aggressively, marketing to populations that had never seen this technology before. Each country faced the same dilemma. How do you balance harm reduction for adult smokers with protecting youth from a new addiction? Some got it right, implementing strict age verification, flavor bans, and public education campaigns. Others failed miserably, letting vaping run unchecked until teenage addiction rates mirrored America's. And everywhere, the same pattern emerged. The industry marketed aggressively, flavors attracted kids, and regulators arrived too late. Vaping was no longer just an American problem. It was a global epidemic, evolving faster than any government could respond, crossing borders as easily as a USB drive in a backpack. The United Kingdom took a radically different approach than the United States. Instead of panicking about youth vaping, British public health officials embraced e-cigarettes as a powerful tool for smoking cessation. Public Health England released reports claiming vaping was 95% safer than smoking and actively encouraged smokers to switch. The National Health Service promoted vaping as part of its stop smoking services. Doctors prescribed e-cigarettes, and it worked. Smoking rates in the UK dropped faster than in most other developed countries. But even the UK wasn't immune to youth vaping. By 2022, surveys showed that vaping among British teenagers had surged, particularly with the rise of disposable vapes like Elf Bar. Brightly colored, fruit-flavored, and cheap, disposables flooded the UK market just as they had in the US. Schools reported the same problems: kids vaping in bathrooms, teachers confiscating devices, parents panicking. The UK government responded with stricter regulations, eventually banning disposable vapes entirely in 2024. It was a dramatic move, and one that showed even countries with pro-vaping policies recognized the youth epidemic was real. Australia went the opposite direction. The country banned nicotine vaping products almost entirely, requiring a prescription to legally purchase them. The rationale was simple. Australia had some of the strictest tobacco laws in the world and some of the lowest smoking rates. They didn't want vaping to undo decades of progress, but bans don't eliminate demand. They create black markets. Australians who wanted to vape simply ordered products online from overseas or bought them from unregulated dealers. The black market thrived, and without regulation, the products flooding in were often dangerous, unverified, and far more potent than anything legally available. Australia's strict approach prevented some youth vaping, but it also created a chaotic underground market. In China, where Han Lik invented the e-cigarette, vaping became a booming industry. Chinese manufacturers produced the vast majority of the world's vaping devices and e-liquids, exporting them to every corner of the globe. Domestically, vaping grew in popularity among young urban professionals who saw it as modern, Western, and sophisticated. Chinese vape brands like Relax became massive companies valued in the billions and expanded aggressively into international markets. In Europe, responses varied wildly by country. France implemented strict regulations, banning flavors and limiting nicotine content. Germany allowed vaping but heavily taxed it. Italy embraced it cautiously. Eastern European countries with weaker regulatory infrastructure saw vaping products flood in with little oversight. And across Europe, the same youth epidemic patterns emerged. Teenagers drawn to flavors, sleek devices, and social media culture. In Latin America, vaping arrived later but grew fast. In countries like Brazil and Mexico, where smoking rates were still relatively high and tobacco regulations weak, vaping companies saw untapped markets. They marketed aggressively, often using the same strategies that had worked in the US: influencers, flavor variety, harm reduction messaging. Teenagers in Mexico City, Buenos Aires, and São Paulo started vaping, often with products imported from the US or China. In Africa and Southeast Asia, vaping was less widespread but growing. In countries with large smoking populations and weak regulatory systems, vaping companies moved in, offering cheap devices and sweet flavors. Public health infrastructure in many of these countries was already strained, and adding a new nicotine epidemic on top of existing tobacco use was disastrous. Some countries tried to ban vaping outright, but enforcement was nearly impossible. The global spread revealed a troubling pattern. The vaping industry operated like a virus, moving from country to country, exploiting regulatory gaps, targeting youth, and creating addiction before governments could respond. And because vaping devices and e-liquids were cheap to manufacture and easy to ship, controlling the flow of products across borders was nearly impossible. A device banned in one country could be easily ordered from a website based in another. International cooperation was minimal. There was no global regulatory framework for vaping. The World Health Organization warned about the risks, but individual countries set their own policies, often influenced by lobbying from the vaping and tobacco industries. Some countries treated vaping as a public health tool. Others treated it as a menace. And in the absence of coordinated action, the industry thrived, selling to anyone, anywhere, regardless of age or intent. By 2025, vaping had become a truly global phenomenon. An estimated 50 million people worldwide used e-cigarettes, including millions of teenagers. The devices that started as a Chinese pharmacist's attempt to quit smoking had become a worldwide epidemic, crossing languages, cultures, and borders. And everywhere it went, the same story played out. Kids got hooked, parents panicked, and regulators arrived too late to stop it. Here's the part that makes vaping so insidious. Nicotine is one of the most addictive substances on Earth. It hijacks the brain's reward system, flooding it with dopamine and creating powerful cravings. And teenage brains, still developing until around age 25, are especially vulnerable. When adolescents use nicotine, it doesn't just create addiction, it actually changes their brain chemistry, affecting memory, attention, and impulse control. Studies showed that teens who vaped were more likely to become cigarette smokers later, despite vaping being marketed as a way to avoid cigarettes. The gateway drug argument, long dismissed by the industry, turned out to be true. Worse, because vaping delivered nicotine so efficiently and so smoothly, kids were consuming far more than previous generations ever did from cigarettes. They were vaping during class, between classes, at lunch, after school, sometimes hitting their device dozens of times a day. And when they tried to quit, the withdrawal was brutal. Irritability, anxiety, insomnia, inability to concentrate. Many couldn't make it through a single day without vaping. They weren't just casual users, they were addicts, and they were still in high school. Nicotine addiction is not a moral failing, it's neuroscience. When nicotine enters the brain, it binds to nicotinic acetylcholine receptors, triggering a release of neurotransmitters, particularly dopamine, in the brain's reward pathways. Dopamine is the feel-good chemical, the same neurotransmitter released when you eat delicious food, have sex, or accomplish something meaningful. It's the brain's way of saying, do that again, and nicotine floods the system with it. But here's the problem. The brain adapts. With repeated nicotine exposure, the brain reduces the number of receptors or makes them less sensitive, a process called downregulation. This means you need more nicotine to get the same dopamine release, which is the definition of tolerance. Meanwhile, your baseline dopamine levels drop. Without nicotine, you feel irritable, anxious, and low, not because you're weak, but because your brain chemistry has been altered. You're not chasing a high anymore. You're chasing normal. This process happens faster in teenagers. The adolescent brain is in a critical period of development, particularly the prefrontal cortex, which controls decision-making, impulse control, and emotional regulation. Introducing nicotine during this period disrupts normal development. Studies using brain imaging have shown that nicotine exposure in adolescence alters the structure, and function of brain regions involved in attention, learning, and mood regulation. Teenagers who vape are essentially rewiring their brains in ways that make them more impulsive, more prone to addiction, and less able to regulate emotions. And the addiction sets in fast. While adult smokers might take months or years to become dependent, teenagers can become addicted in weeks. A study published in the journal Pediatrics found that some adolescents reported symptoms of nicotine dependence after vaping for just a few days. They experienced cravings, withdrawal, and an inability to cut down, even when they wanted to. The speed and intensity of addiction shocked researchers. Vaping wasn't just as addictive as smoking for teenagers. It might be more addictive. Part of this is due to how efficiently vaping delivers nicotine. Cigarettes deliver nicotine through combustion, which is harsh and limits how deeply or frequently you can inhale. Vaping, especially with nicotine salts, is smooth and pleasant. You can take hit after hit without discomfort. Teenagers were hitting their vapes 20, 30, 50 times a day, far more than they would ever smoke cigarettes. And each hit delivered a quick spike of nicotine, reinforcing the behavior. The withdrawal symptoms were severe. Teenagers trying to quit reported intense cravings, irritability, mood swings, anxiety, depression, difficulty concentrating, and insomnia. These symptoms could last for weeks, making it nearly impossible to quit without support. Many teens tried to quit multiple times and failed, which only deepened their sense of hopelessness and shame. They knew vaping was bad for them. They wanted to stop, but their brains wouldn't let them. Teachers noticed the effects in the classroom. Students who were addicted to nicotine were fidgety, distracted, and unable to focus. They asked to use the bathroom constantly, not because they needed to, but because they needed to vape. When they couldn't access nicotine, they became irritable and disruptive. Grades dropped. Attendance suffered. Mental health declined. And then there was the gateway effect. The vaping industry had long insisted that vaping didn't lead to cigarette smoking, that it was an alternative, not a pathway. But the data told a different story. Longitudinal studies found that teenagers who vaped were 3 to 4 times more likely to start smoking cigarettes than those who didn't vape. Why? Because vaping normalized nicotine use, reduced the stigma around tobacco, and primed the brain's reward system to crave nicotine. Once addicted to nicotine through vaping, some teens found cigarettes more accessible or cheaper and made the switch. The very product marketed as a way to quit smoking was actually creating new smokers. The addiction science was clear. Nicotine, regardless of delivery method, was a powerful drug that hijacked the brain, especially young brains. Vaping had been marketed as harmless, as fun, as just flavored clouds. But underneath those clouds was a chemical dependency that was ruining lives, one hit at a time. The teenagers vaping in high school bathrooms weren't rebels or troublemakers. They were addicts, trapped by a substance they didn't fully understand and a brain that demanded more. And that's where we'll leave the story tonight. From Honlick's workshop in 2003 to high school bathrooms in 2025, vaping went from a grief-stricken inventor's dream to a global addiction crisis in just over 2 decades. It was supposed to save lives. Instead, it created a new generation of nicotine addicts, most of them kids who would never have touched a cigarette. The flavors made it sweet. The design made it discreet. The marketing made it cool. And the nicotine made it impossible to stop. We've watched this story unfold in real time, companies chasing profits, regulators playing catch-up, parents panicking, and teenagers caught in the middle, their developing brains hijacked by a substance they didn't fully understand. Some escaped, many didn't, and millions more are still struggling, trying to quit something that feels impossible to give up. The long-term consequences won't be known for decades. We're still writing that chapter. But one thing is certain: vaping changed the landscape of nicotine addiction forever. It proved that even in an age of information, of public health campaigns and anti-smoking success stories, an entire generation could still be seduced by a new delivery system wrapped in Silicon Valley aesthetics and fruit flavors. History repeats itself, just with different packaging. Big Tobacco became Big Vape, Joe Camel became Juul, and the promise of harm reduction became a pipeline to addiction. The names changed, the devices evolved, but the pattern remained depressingly familiar: profit over people, innovation without oversight, and teenagers paying the price. So if you're listening to this and you vape, or you know someone who does, remember, this isn't a story about bad people making bad choices. It's a story about addiction, about brain chemistry, about companies that knew exactly what they were doing and did it anyway. Quitting is hard. Addiction is real. And if you're struggling, you're not alone. There are resources, counselors, programs designed to help. You're not weak for being hooked. You're human, caught in a trap that was set deliberately and expertly. And if you're a parent listening to this, worried about your kids, just remember, the best protection is conversation. Not lectures, not fear tactics, but honest dialogue about what vaping really is, what nicotine really does, and why those mango-flavored clouds aren't as harmless as they seem. Your kids are smarter than the industry gives them credit for. They just need the truth. The story of vaping isn't over. It'll keep evolving, keep changing, keep finding new ways to hook new users, but maybe, just maybe, by understanding how we got here, from a Chinese pharmacist's grief to a global epidemic, we can make better choices about where we go next. Thanks for listening tonight. I hope this helped you understand how something that started with good intentions became one of the defining public health crises of the 21st century. Sleep well, and remember, behind every technology, every innovation, every product promising a better future, there are real consequences for real people. And sometimes those consequences take decades to fully understand. Until next time, this is Snoozy Sleep Stories. Sweet dreams and breathe easy.